The train pulled into the station at Redstone Junction in a great hiss of steam and grinding brakes, and Clara Whitmore stood at the platform's edge with her portfolio of correspondence clutched against her chest, reading over the last letter one final time, as though the familiar handwriting might rearrange itself into some more reassuring shape before she had to face the man who had written it. She had married Nathaniel Cross by letter 3 weeks prior, in a small ceremony conducted by proxy. In her sister's parlor back in Boston, with a judge standing in for the groom and Clara speaking her vows to an empty chair while her sister wept with a mixture of joy and worry that Clara had, at the time, dismissed as sentimental excess. Now, watching the crowd gathered on the platform, scanning the unfamiliar faces for one that might match the careful, educated hand that had written her 100 pages of courtship over 8 months, Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. She had answered his advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette on something close to a whim, though she told herself and her sister it was practicality. She was 26, unmarried, with a father recently dead and no fortune to speak of, and the prospects for a woman of her station in Boston had narrowed considerably in the 2 years since. Nathaniel Cross's letters had been unlike the others she'd received in response to her own advertisement, thoughtful and literate, discussing books he'd read and questions of philosophy and the particular quality of light over the mountains near his ranch, and by the 4th month of correspondence Clara had found herself genuinely, foolishly, hopefully in love with a man she had never seen, constructing in her mind an image of him built from the elegance of his prose. A man perhaps like her late father, gentle-spoken, thoughtful, patient. The man who stepped forward from the crowd and removed his hat, revealing a head of curly dark hair going every direction and a close-cropped beard that did nothing to soften a face weathered hard by sun and work, was nothing at all like the man Clara had built in her imagination. He was broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of physical labor rather than the sedentary letter-writing she had pictured. His hands, when he extended one toward her, were scarred and calloused, and there was a directness in his gray eyes that felt, to Clara in that first startled moment, less like the gentle intelligence of his letters and more like something harder, more assessing. The look of a man taking stock of livestock rather than greeting a wife. "Mrs. Cross," he said, and his voice was low and rough, entirely unlike the voice she had imagined belonging to those careful, poetic letters. "You made good time. I wasn't expecting the train till evening." Clara, who had spent 8 months imagining 100 different versions of this meeting, found herself entirely unable to summon any of the responses she had rehearsed. "Mr. Cross," she managed, and her voice came out thinner than she intended. "I confess I did not expect, that is, your letters gave me to understand, that I'd be something other than what I am," Nathaniel finished for her, and there was no anger in it. Only a kind of weary resignation, as though this were a conversation he had anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. "I reckoned as much might happen. My sister writes a fine hand and a finer sentence, Mrs. Cross, and I'll admit I let her compose most of those letters on my behalf, since I never had much schooling and even less patience for putting thoughts to paper. Everything in them was true, mind you. My own thoughts, my own answers to your questions, but the words themselves were mostly hers. I should have told you sooner. I see now that was a mistake." The confession landed on Clara like a physical blow, and she stood on that platform, her carefully constructed romantic ideal crumbling in the space of a single sentence, feeling the crowd's eyes on her, feeling the particular humiliation of having crossed half a continent to marry a stranger who was, in every meaningful sense, still entirely a stranger, his true voice as unfamiliar to her as his face. "You deceived me," she said, and her voice shook now with something closer to anger than shock. "I married the author of those letters, Mr. Cross, and it seems that man does not exist." "I never lied about what mattered," Nathaniel said, his jaw tightening. "Not about the ranch, not about my prospects, not about my character. I let my sister's pen make me sound finer than I am, and that was a poor decision, but I am not a different man than the one who answered your questions honestly, letter after letter. I just answered them plain, and she dressed the answers up pretty." He picked up her trunk without waiting for her agreement, hefting it with an ease that spoke to the physical strength his letters had never once mentioned. "You're welcome to take the next train back to Boston if that's your wish, Mrs. Cross, and I'll not stand in your way nor think less of you for it." But I'd ask you consider staying at least a season before you decide. A marriage deserves more of a trial than 5 minutes on a train platform." Clara stood there, torn between the very reasonable urge to demand passage back east on the next available train and a stubborn thread of pride that refused to let her flee at the first disappointment, however profound. She thought of her sister's parlor, of the empty chair she'd spoken her vows to, of the letter she'd have to write explaining her return, of the particular shame of a failed marriage added to the already considerable shame of reduced circumstances that had driven her to answer a matrimonial advertisement in the first place. And beneath all of that, some quieter, more honest part of her noted that whatever anger and disappointment she felt toward the deception of the letters, there had been nothing dishonest in the man's manner just now, only a rough, uncomfortable honesty that was, in its own way, rather more admirable than pretty words penned by a sister's practiced hand. "1 season," she said finally, each word costing her considerable effort. "I will stay through the winter, Mr. Cross, and we shall see what remains of this arrangement come spring. But I will tell you plainly that I feel I have been deceived, and it will take considerably more than an apology on a train platform to restore my confidence in you." "That's fair," Nathaniel said, and something in his weathered face relaxed slightly, as though he had expected a harsher verdict. "More than fair, given the circumstances. I'll not ask for more than the chance to prove myself an honest man, whatever my sister's letters made me sound like." The ranch itself, when they arrived after a long, largely silent wagon ride through country that grew increasingly wild and beautiful as they left the town behind, proved to be exactly as prosperous as Nathaniel's letters had described. A sturdy log house with good outbuildings and pastures that stretched toward mountains, just beginning to show their first dusting of early snow. Clara's room, prepared with what she recognized, once her initial anger had cooled enough to notice such things, as considerable care. Fresh linens, a small vase of late wildflowers on the washstand, a shelf that had been cleared for books she hadn't yet unpacked, suggested a man who had, whatever the deception of the letters, genuinely anticipated her arrival with something like hope rather than mere practical necessity. The first weeks were difficult ones, marked by a careful, formal distance between them that neither seemed to know how to bridge. Nathaniel worked from before dawn until well after dark, as ranch work demanded, and their meals together were quiet affairs, punctuated by stilted attempts at conversation that never quite recovered the easy warmth of the letters, because, Clara came to understand, that warmth had never truly belonged to the man across the table from her at all, but to a sister with a gift for words that her brother simply did not share. She found herself, in those first weeks, deeply lonely in a way she had not anticipated, missing the imagined intimacy of the correspondence more than she had ever missed any actual person, grieving a version of her husband that had never existed outside of ink and paper. But Clara Whitmore Cross was not a woman inclined toward passive suffering, and as the weeks wore on, she began, out of equal parts boredom and stubborn curiosity, to actually observe the man she had married rather than simply mourning the man she had expected. She noticed that Nathaniel, though rough-spoken and uneducated in the formal sense, possessed a keen and careful intelligence that expressed itself not in eloquent phrases but in the quality of his attention. The way he noticed when a fence post had shifted before it became a real problem, the way he seemed to understand his cattle and horses with an intuition that bordered on the uncanny, the way he treated the elderly ranch hand, a man named Ezra who'd worked the land since before Nathaniel's own father had owned it, with a patient respect that spoke to genuine character rather than mere obligation. She noticed, too, small unspoken kindnesses, wildflowers appearing on her washstand each week without comment. Her favorite tea somehow always kept stocked in the pantry, though she'd mentioned her preference only once in passing. The way he'd taken to leaving his boots outside the door rather than tracking mud through the house he knew she worked hard to keep clean. A small courtesy that he performed without ever remarking on it or seeming to expect thanks. It was Ezra, in fact, who first opened Clara's eyes to the fuller truth of her husband's character, catching her alone in the barn one crisp morning while she waited for Nathaniel to finish saddling her a gentle mare for a ride he'd insisted she needed, having noticed her restlessness cooped up in the house. "You've got a hard read on him, I expect," Ezra said, without preamble, in the manner of old men who have earned the right to speak plainly. "On account of them letters not sounding like the man himself. But I've known Nathaniel Cross since he was a boy of 10, watched him nurse this ranch back from near ruin after his father drank himself into an early grave and left debts that would have broken most men. He gave every hired hand a fair wage even in the leanest years, sooner going without himself than shorting a man's pay. He rode 2 days through a blizzard 3 winters back to fetch a doctor for my wife when the fever took her, and sat up with me the whole week after she passed so I wouldn't grieve alone. He's not a man of pretty words, Mrs. Cross, and I'll grant his sister did him no favors dressing up his letters the way she did. But you'd be hard-pressed to find a finer man in this territory, whatever his letters sounded like. Clara turned Ezra's words over in her mind through the ride that followed, watching Nathaniel from a new vantage as he rode ahead of her, pointing out landmarks and features of the land with the same rough, unpolished manner she had initially mistaken for indifference but was coming, slowly, to recognize as simple reticence, a man uncomfortable with ornamentation who nonetheless felt things deeply and expressed them, when he expressed them at all, through action rather than speech. When they paused at a ridge overlooking a valley turning gold with the last of autumn, Nathaniel dismounted and helped her down, and for a moment they stood together in a silence that felt, for the first time since the train platform, less like awkward distance and more like something approaching companionship. "I owe you a proper apology," Nathaniel said finally, staring out at the valley rather than at her, in the manner of a man who found direct confrontation of feeling difficult even when he was determined to attempt it. "Not for the letters only, though that was wrong of me, letting my sister's pen speak for a heart she couldn't rightly know, but for not trying harder these past weeks to bridge what stands between us. I've been a coward about it, if I'm honest, afraid that whatever I said plain in my own voice would only disappoint you further after the letters already had." "You've been kind," Clara said, surprising herself with the readiness of the observation. "In every way that matters, Nathaniel. You've been kinder than the letters ever managed to convey. I think I mistook your quietness for coldness, when it seems, the more I come to know you, that it was only ever a different language than the one I expected to hear love spoken in." "Is that what you're looking for?" Nathaniel asked, turning to face her now, something cautiously hopeful in his weathered face. "Love, in whatever language it comes?" "I think," Clara said slowly, "that I came out here already half in love with a man who existed only on paper, and I have spent these past weeks slowly, reluctantly, falling in love instead with a very different man who actually stands before me, rough words and calloused hands and all, and finding, rather to my own surprise, that I prefer this version considerably to the one I imagined." Whatever formal reserve had characterized their courtship dissolved, after that afternoon on the ridge, into something warmer and more genuine, built not on eloquent letters but on the accumulated evidence of 1,000 small daily kindnesses, on conversations that grew easier as Clara learned to draw out Nathaniel's thoughts with patience rather than expecting the polish his sister's pen had promised, on a partnership that deepened through the practical work of the ranch as much as through any romantic gesture. Clara took to keeping the ranch's accounts, a task at which she proved unexpectedly gifted, and Nathaniel, in turn, began teaching her to ride properly, to recognize the signs of coming weather, to understand the rhythms of the land that would be her home now in truth rather than merely on paper. Winter closed in around them in earnest by December, binding them together in the particular intimacy of a house shared against hard weather, and by the time the first true blizzard howled down from the mountains, trapping them together by the fire for 3 full days while the world outside turned white and impassable, Clara found she could not any longer distinguish where her disappointment in the letters had ended and her genuine love for the man himself had begun, only that the transformation felt, in retrospect, inevitable rather than surprising. It was during that very blizzard, with the fire crackling and the wind howling against the shutters, that Nathaniel finally attempted, in his own halting way, to put into his own words what his sister's pen had once tried and failed to properly convey. "I'm no poet, Clara," he said, sitting close beside her on the settee, his rough hand finding hers in the firelight. "I never will be, whatever fine phrases got put in those letters. But I love you plainly and completely, in whatever poor words I've got to say it, and I am grateful every single day that you stayed past that first hard afternoon at the train station to let me prove it, rather than climbing back aboard and leaving me to whatever poor bachelor's life I'd have made for myself otherwise." "I very nearly did leave," Clara admitted, leaning into him with an ease that would have astonished the frightened, angry woman who had stood on that platform months before. "I have never been more grateful for a moment of stubborn pride in my entire life." They were married again that spring, this time with real vows spoken by real people who had come to know and love each other in the months between. A small ceremony attended by Ezra and the other hands and the handful of neighbors who had watched the strange courtship unfold with considerable interest, and Clara wore, at Nathaniel's quiet insistence, the same traveling dress she had worn stepping off that train. A private joke between them about the distance a person could travel, in every sense, between disappointment and genuine joy. Nathaniel's sister, upon learning the full story in a letter Clara herself composed and sent east that summer, wrote back with considerable amusement and no small relief, confessing she had always worried her flowery letters might set her brother up for exactly the kind of disappointment Clara had initially felt, and expressing her delight that the truth of him had, in the end, proven far more compelling than any fiction she could have penned on his behalf. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had met, Clara would tell the story with a wry, affectionate humor that had not been available to her in that first bitter hour on the train platform, describing the shock of discovering the eloquent correspondent she'd crossed a continent to marry was, in fact, a rough-spoken rancher who barely wrote a word of his own courtship, and then describing, with considerably more warmth, the slow unfolding of genuine love that had grown in the space where disappointment might otherwise have taken root, a love built not on pretty words but on wildflowers left quietly on a washstand, on boots removed at the door out of simple consideration, on a man who rode through blizzards for the people he cared about and loved his wife plainly, completely, and without a single borrowed phrase, in a language that Clara had needed time to learn but had come, in the end, to find more eloquent than any letter ever could have been.